Hi, this is Debbie Wilson, and I'm continuing sharing information about Passover. And as if you have watched these videos that I've done so far, you can see that there's so much to learn. And Passover is not complicated. It's just deep and wide and rich, and there's just so much to glean from it. So I'm just kind of sharing insights that I have seen over the years and learned from other teachers, and just hoping that you can enjoy them too, because they have greatly enriched my life. So during this time prior to Passover, we are instructed in the Word to get the leaven out of our house. It was during this time before Passover that Yahshua threw the money changers out of the temple. We believe he was cleaning his Father's house. During that time, the religious system of the temple was very full of corruption. And this was in the holy place that they were selling things to be sacrificed. Remember that the priest had to examine your lamb. And at that time, the priests weren't even priests necessarily. They weren't from the right line, because God was very specific about who could be a priest. And it was only the line of Levi that could be a priest at all. And people had bought their way into the priesthood, and it had become quite a little money-making machine there. And so anyway, when people would bring in their lambs for the Passover, the priest had to examine them, and they would search and search until they found some little minuscule thing that would disqualify the lambs, so that people had to buy lambs that were raised by them. And so they were making quite a lot of money that way. And so that's one of the reasons that Yahshua probably overturned the tables and called them a den of thieves. So back to the calendar, during the first month, from the 10th to the 14th, remember that the lambs lived with the people and they were examined. And they also had to be examined by the priests. So Yahshua, he was examined by the Pharisees and the Herodians. They tried to catch him in his words. They tried to find fault. Pilate also tried to find fault. But he was a perfect and spotless lamb. So they bound Yahshua to the stake at the 3rd hour. Now, this was the time of the morning sacrifice. You'll notice the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th hour frequently in the Bible, where the 3rd and the 9th hours was the morning and the evening sacrifices, and the 6th hour was around noon, and that was an hour of prayer. So Yahshua was bound at the 3rd hour, the time of the morning sacrifice, at the same time that they were binding the lambs to the horns of the altar. They were binding Yahshua to the stake. And then there was darkness from the 6th hour, remember that's noon, that's the hour of prayer, to the 9th hour, at the time of the evening sacrifice. So Yahshua died at the exact moment, the 9th hour, that the lambs were being sacrificed. Now during the time of Messiah, we know from the writings of Josephus that there were around 150,000 lambs slain on Temple Mount during Passover. The blood would run under the altar to an underground trench, and then there are cisterns under the temple that hold thousands of gallons of water. So after the sacrifices, they would open the gates to release the water and wash the blood out. A mixture of blood and water flowed out the side of Temple Mount. Likewise, after Yahshua was sacrificed, a soldier pierced him in the right side, and a mixture of blood and water rushed out or flowed out. So the veil of the Holy of Holies, it was likened to a garment in Hebrew thought. And I'm sure you probably know about the mourning ritual in Judaism called Karaya. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. You see it multiple times in the Bible stories. They would rend their garments in grief to show their heartbreak. This should give us some insight into the rending of the veil of the Holy of Holies. So in our Greek mindset, time is linear. It just runs in a line, and once it's passed, and you don't ever get to go back. It goes in a straight line, and you're done. But in the Father's time, or in his calendar, it goes in cycles, okay? So the question is not necessarily, has this feast been fulfilled yet, but how many times will this feast be fulfilled? For this prophecy, how many times will this prophecy be fulfilled? As an example, let's start with the 10th of the month, and I'll show you things that happen over and over on the same days in the scriptures. So we see the 10th of Nisan, or the 10th of the first month. That's when they set aside an unblemished lamb until the 14th. That's when Israel crossed over the Jordan after 40 years in the wilderness. It's the day that Yahshua rode in Jerusalem on a donkey, and it's the day that Ezekiel had his vision of the millennial temple. On the 14th of the first month, that's Passover each year. That's the day that Abraham received a covenant with the Father about the promised land. It's the day that King Josiah ordered the idolatry out of the temple, and it was restored, and Hilkiah the priest discovered the Torah, the book of the law, and the people rededicated themselves. It's the day of the dedication of the second temple, the day that Messiah was crucified, and the day that the firstborns all died in Egypt. So you can see we got these cycles, same days, happening over and over. On the 15th day, that is the day of unleavened bread, when the week of unleavened bread starts. So the Passover in the book of Exodus, that is actually not the first kind of Passover that is noted in the scriptures. It is on around that time that we have the three angels that come to Abraham and tell him that at that moed, that appointed time, the Sarah will have a son. Remember Moedim? That's the same thing that's the same word as the festivals in the Bible. And they said, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the moed, the appointed time, the next year." And so remember, they served a meal and it was rushed. And the next morning, Lot was delivered from destruction. And it's as further evidence in Genesis 19, 1 through 3, the two angels come to Sodom and they visit Lot, and it's specifically mentioned that Lot prepared a meal and made unleavened bread. So again, it's kind of giving us these little clues that this Passover. Okay. Then, on the 17th day of the month, that is the first fruits, the Feast of First Fruits. Remember, that's the day that Messiah he arose from the grave. That's also the day that Noah's Ark rested on Mount Ararat. And the day that manna stopped, manna stopped on the 16th day, so that on the 17th day, Israel ate the first fruits of the land after they had crossed over. And it's also the day that Haman, in the book of Esther, Haman was hung on his own gallows with his 10 sons. It's interesting also that after World War II, at the Nuremberg war crimes trials of the Nazi leaders, 7 Nazis hung on the 17th day of Nisan, the first month. It's the day that the 7 sons of Saul were hung at the beginning of the harvest cycle, which is Nisan 17. Moses crossed the Red Sea on the 17th day of the first month, and the walls of Jericho fell on that day. the cleansing of the temple by Hezekiah, and of course the resurrection of Messiah. As a further evidence, this is not a feast of the Lord that I'm going to tell you about. It's something on the Jewish calendar called the 9th of Av. It's very interesting. It is thought to be the day that the 10 spies brought back a bad report about the Promised Land. So all sorts of bad things tend to happen on that day, and every year they do a fast. They actually fast and pray to this day on the 9th of Av because so many bad things have happened on that day. It's the day that the first temple was destroyed. It's the day that the second temple was destroyed. And in that day, on the year 1290, the Jews were forced out of England. On that day in 1492, the Jews were forced out of Spain. And in 1914, on that day, World War I began. In 1942, Treblinka extermination camp opened in Poland on the 9th of Av. And in the year 2005, on the 9th of Av, the Gaza Strip was evacuated and the Jews were kicked out of their land. So, in the week before Passover, we clean our houses. This is where spring cleaning originated, and we're told in Scripture to remove all the leaven from our houses, the yeast, the baking soda or powder, and any foods or breads or noodles or anything that contains leavening, any cookies or cakes, it all goes. So it's an object lesson to search every corner of our heart to remove any sins or other leaven hidden there. Israel was freed from slavery in Egypt, but Messiah freed us from our sin. But leaven is more than just sin. Leaven in Hebrew is chemetz, and it means bitter or sour, sin, false teachings, or arrogance. And so when Yahshua said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, we have to remember that the Pharisees were the spiritual authorities at that time on Scripture, and they went to school to learn their doctrine. They were the authorities. They were the ones that knew Scripture. And the Hebrews at that time, they used the sourdough method. They would pull off a chunk of dough and pull it in a warm, moist place where it would gather the yeast from the air, the spores of the air. And then they would mix that old lump of dough in with a new, fresh batch, and then take out a chunk of that batch to leaven the next generation of dough. And so leavening it's also false teachings that we pass down from generation to generation with things that we have believed or taught or whatever, and it just keeps getting passed down through all our generations. And so this is the time that we need to examine our beliefs and our we just need to get to the truth during this time and kick out anything that we've been doing that maybe isn't quite biblical, and we're trying to get biblical here. So we read in Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, when he's kind of talking about this, and he's saying, purge out the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. And he goes on to describe unleavened bread as sincerity and truth. So the word matzah means sweet or without sourness. And I think that's probably enough for today. So during this time, start eating up your bread, all that you have in your cabinets. I try to clean it all out, and we actually do that object lesson of going through our house a few days or the week before Passover, and purposely remove or eat things up, get them out of our house, so that we can have our house prepared for this set apart time that's coming up. Okay, well, I think that's enough for now. I hope you got something out of this, and hope you're enjoying these little talks. So thank you. All right, bye-bye.